So I was going to these amazing parties with the biggest pop stars in Brazil, super famous people in their houses, their villas on the top of a mountain looking out over the Atlantic Ocean. It was insane, and all because I took the time to learn Portuguese. Welcome back to the channel, guys. My name is Olly Richards, and if you're new here, welcome. This channel is all about helping you learn a new language through the power of story, so you can become fluent faster and live your best life. And today I'm going to talk about how I learned Brazilian Portuguese. And when I think about the languages that have had the most impact on me and given me some of the most incredible experiences of my life, Brazilian Portuguese, bar none, is right up there, just for the sheer insanity of the whole thing. So at this point, this was my third foreign language. There are two other videos in this series so far in chronological order, starting with how I learned French and then how I learned Spanish. And so what's important here is as I was going into learning Portuguese, this was not my first rodeo. By this point, I'd kind of already developed this feeling that, hey, I can learn a language now. I had like this supreme confidence. And as I've talked about in these earlier videos, this confidence is really important because it's the difference between kind of feeling your way through a language, just experimenting and exploring, and then actually grabbing the bull by the horns and saying, right, I'm going to learn this thing now. So the story of how I learned Portuguese takes place over about 2 to 3 years, give or take. See, the thing about language learning is there's never a point where you can say, okay, I have learned this language now. It's always a moving target, and you continue to learn for your entire life. But I'd say from the point where I started at 0 to the point where I was kind of comfortably fluent and could go anywhere in Brazil and be totally fine, that process was somewhere between 2 to 3 years from beginning to end. And so in terms of my method and how I went about learning it, when I think back to that time, I didn't really have any concept of method as such, because it was still very early days for me. I'd learned a few languages in the space of a couple of years. All I really knew is that if I just applied myself to the language, then I would learn it. And there were a few things that came together to make that happen. So first of all, I had made a few Brazilian friends in London. I was at university at the time, studying for a music degree. I'd made some Brazilian friends, and I had this experience that lots of people have where I just suddenly discovered the world of Brazil and just fell in love with it. I was like, man, I just grew up in this very kind of boring, or what I thought at the time to be kind of boring, normal, monolingual English environment. And here's Brazil, where these people are just like dancing on the beach, and this caricature of what Brazilians are like. And so when I discovered this world through these friends that I'd met in London, I immediately felt very, very drawn to it. I was one of these people growing up who always felt that I didn't quite belong and there was something better on the other side. And Brazil really kind of painted a picture of something really, really cool that I wanted to discover. So these friends that I met, I was speaking to them in English, but they would do what all Brazilians do, which is what Brazilians are so great for, which is they would just talk to me about their culture. They talk to me about Brazil. They'd play me like Gilberto Gil, Caetano Veloso, like on repeat. Like we just listened to Brazilian music all night. And because I was already a musician, there was a kind of a fusion here with my interest in music, the people I've met, and the language. And so this is like what started it off for me. And this is also, I think, a key part of the success that I had with Portuguese. It's the fact that it wasn't just an academic exercise. It was very much fusing my interest in languages with this cultural interest and the passion for music all together. And so I remember when I first started off, I was just kind of following my gut. And that following my gut thing is, I know it's like really unhelpful for you to know what I was doing, but I can tell you specifically what I was doing. I didn't realize this was a method at the time, but there were 3 things I was doing in particular. The first thing was just spending time with my friends, and they would teach me the odd Brazilian word or phrase. Like, oh, Olly, you have to know the word saudade. It's a very Brazilian word. Oh, saudade, cool. So I'd learn words there and just be in that environment generally. The second thing was something that I picked up from my experience learning French, which you can hear about if you go back and watch that video on French, which was the idea of a language exchange. I had had a lot of success with language exchanges when I lived in Paris. And so one of the first things I did when I started learning Portuguese was I asked my friends, hey, do you know anyone who's here learning English? Can you introduce me? Can we meet up and do a language exchange, English and Portuguese? And so my friend Nicole introduced me to Luciana, and we started meeting like quite a lot, like 2 or 3 times a week, doing these exchanges in English and Portuguese. And so I started to piece together the language there. I'd ask, how do you say this? How do you say that? Just trying to figure out how to communicate in basic ways in Portuguese. So my friends, number 1, the language exchange, number 2. But the third really crucial part, which I've only really done in Portuguese, is music. And I really loved Brazilian music. I loved the kind of the ritmo de samba, the samba rhythm, the bossa nova rhythm of the music. I love just the positivity of the music in general. And so my main instrument is piano, but I also kind of wanted to pick up the guitar. So I remember sitting in my room on the internet, and you've got to remember this is like 2001 or something like that, 2001, 2002. So there wasn't much on the internet, but already at that point you could find the lyrics to bossa nova songs with the guitar chords. And so I remember sitting in my room for days on end, weeks on end, sitting with my guitar, which I couldn't play, figuring out how to play an A major 7 chord and then an E dominant 7th, figuring out how to play those chords on the guitar, whilst also learning to sing these songs in Brazilian Portuguese, which I didn't understand at that point, but I was just learning to play and sing these songs on guitar in a language that I didn't understand, but I knew I wanted to. And so looking back on this now, what I realized I'd done is given myself full immersion in the language, really, through a rather unconventional way, through kind of language exchanges and learning music. But, it doesn't really matter how you get this immersion, but that you get it is the key thing. So, on this channel, I always talk about learning through stories, but it doesn't have to be stories. The kind of broader umbrella concept with learning through stories is learning through input. And that input can be lots of things. It can be through speaking, ironically, because when you're speaking, you get to listen a lot as well. The trouble with that is that you often don't really get much time actually listening. So it's not a very efficient way, but it does count. But through music, I was just immersed in Portuguese all the time. So even though now I teach learning through reading in my new Portuguese Uncovered course, which is coming up, it may already be out by the time you watch this video, I'll put a link in the description below, is going to be based on reading and on stories, because it's just such an efficient way to learn. But I was getting that when I was learning Portuguese through bossa nova and samba, basically. And I was learning these lyrics, looking up the words one by one, learning to sing these songs. Olha que coisa mais linda, mais cheia de graça. I didn't know what that meant, but I just looked up all the words. And then eventually, after learning, 20 or 30 songs, I kind of just got this foundation in the language. And then it was very cool then that I had these friendship groups, because I would take these things that I learned. And I was just like 21-year-old English guy, go around to my friend's house and then pick up a guitar and start singing these songs with the guitar in Portuguese. And they just found that the funniest thing ever. And they loved it. And then so I would kind of meet more Brazilians from time to time, and my friends would go, you should listen to this gringo playing bossa nova. So I would. So there was an element of kind of performance and theatre in this. I was loving it. I was the centre of attention. It was just amazing for me. And then I started speaking with people more and more, and I would basically start to speak by using a combination of things that I'd learned in my language exchange, words that my friends had taught me, but often and probably mostly things that I'd learned from music. So I'd meet someone and then kind of just like joke around with them by talking to them using phrases that I'd learned from songs. So I'd talk to a girl and say something like, esse seu olhar, quando encontrar o meu, fala de umas coisas que eu não posso acreditar. Really kind of like these kind of super cheesy romantic lyrics from song, and I just kind of try it out on people just jokingly, and it works like a charm, because for Brazilians in London, finding English people who have taken the time, have fallen in love with their culture and take the time to learn it, well, that was a major thing for them. And so this kind of method ended up being this really great virtuous circle of opportunities, and one thing kind of reinforcing the next. During this time, I had built up Brazil and Brazilian culture to be this huge fantasy, because I'd experienced it in London, but I'd never been to Brazil. And so Brazil became this kind of fantasy for me. And so there came a point when I actually started going to Brazil. And this is where things started to change in some interesting ways. I think it's worth saying that by that point, I was what you might call a kind of confident student. I could speak Portuguese, I could have conversations. Often I needed a bit of help from sympathetic conversation partners. There was still a lot I didn't understand. When I started going to Brazil, that's when I realized, man, okay, like there's a whole world out there that I don't understand. It's a bit like the kind of Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where you have the impression that you're much better than you are. So I could kind of function quite comfortably with Brazilians in London who knew that they were abroad and had to accommodate me. But when I got to Brazil, that was very different. So I began by taking a few small trips to Brazil to visit the friends I'd made in London, some of whom had already gone back to Brazil, and we kind of hang out mostly in Sao Paulo, and then do a few trips up to kind of Bahia. I was still with my friends in that environment though, so it was quite like controlled. I was shepherded in a way. But there came a point after I'd finished university, this was like, 2 years into my journey learning Portuguese, where me and a friend, Stefano, decided, right, we're going to move to Brazil. Because like, why not? You're 20 something, why not, right? And I had this kind of fantasy image of Brazil. So we kind of picked up, we moved to Rio, and we ended up living in Rio for about 6 months. And I just remember arriving at the beginning, and we found this house near Alagoa, near Copacabana. And I remember just walking through Copacabana, just talking to people that I met. And I didn't understand a thing. I realized that I had been like in this kind of Paulista bubble of like, so basically friends from Sao Paulo, who you call Paulistas, who had been kind of protecting me linguistically, When I got down to getting down to brass tacks on the streets of Rio, like there's none of that. There's no protection. You're just like, you sink or swim. And I realized immediately, man, I really don't understand. Like I'm only understanding 20, 30% here. They're speaking very fast. It's full of slang. And it was really, really tough. And so over the course of that 6 months, I think, I had this full immersion in Rio, and then bit by bit, through just blunt force and exposure and speaking a lot of Portuguese, I just got better and better and better. And that time was crazy in Rio. I mean, Rio is a crazy place anyway, but because of my interest in music, I started to get some connections. So through a combination of music plus some of the friends that I'd met in London, I got into some musical circles in Rio, which were quite interesting. So I got introduced to and became friends with Milton Nascimento, who's like one of the biggest all-time music stars in Brazil. Any Brazilian listening knows him. Any non-Brazilian probably doesn't, but he's the equivalent of a kind of Paul McCartney in the Brazilian music world. And so I kind of started going to his house, hanging out with him. He would throw these big parties, and I would be there going to his parties, hanging out with people like Bete Carvalho, Lenine, huge music stars in Brazil. And then he would organize these pagodes there, which are like these people sitting around a table playing samba. And I was, a musician, so I was kind of learning to play these instruments. And then I've got, there was a time when I remember having a jam session with the Velha Guarda da Mangueira, which is like one of the kind of old groups associated with one of the biggest sambas. It's a big deal. And I was there, like this 20-something-year-old, like playing cavaquinho with a Velha Guarda da Mangueira na casa do Milton. And you got to realize, like, he lives in this huge, great house in Tijuca, like on top of a hill looking over the ocean, like pure kind of pop star luxury. And I was just there in the middle of all of this. Like I'd leave his house in the evening, and like Lenini would give me a ride back to downtown Rio. And I was just kind of there thinking, how did this happen? And what did I do to deserve this? It was an incredible experience. And it was all just through kind of, one of those kind of fortunate combinations of events and people that I met. And so like this became my life in Rio. It was a combination of going to these like hanging out in these kind of big celebrity parties, and then also slumming it in the samba schools, which are out in the favelas, in these very kind of dangerous, rundown parts of town, where I would go and like stay up all night, like with these samba schools, like drinking cachaça. It was insane. But all the time, I was just speaking Portuguese. I was in a fully Portuguese environment. My good friend Laurie came out there after a while. He's also like very similar to me, into music and languages and stuff. So we would just kind of be around Rio every night, going out, meeting people, speaking Portuguese. And so it was very much this process of becoming Brazilian, really. And this is why I think I had so much success with Portuguese. It's just that I made it my life. And when I've learned languages after that, subsequently, whether it be Japanese or Arabic or whatever, I've always been aware that however hard I study, there's been this gap where, because of the stage of life that I'm in, it's not really been possible to make this language really a part of my life. Because as you get older, you just have so much more going on. You have work, you have family, you have all these things. And I think it does become increasingly difficult to really go that extra mile and really integrate language into part of your life. It becomes hard. But thanks to that experience, both in, Portuguese, but also to an extent in Spanish and French as well, what that taught me was that the study, as you call it, the traditional study process is such a small part of the overall journey of becoming fluent. You can study things all day long, but you turn up in Rio and you're stuck. So I just remember kind of talking to people and like trying to imitate exactly. They would say something, I'd imitate it in my head. I tried to make my body language exactly like theirs is, and I would just be really just trying to be very kind of turning pro, if you like, in the language. I was really obsessed with it in the way that a musician is obsessed with mastering their instrument. But since the time I got to Rio and spent time in Brazil, I really wasn't studying anymore. I think I probably, made the odd flashcard and I probably wrote a lot of things down, but I almost didn't need to study because I just had that wonderful environment. And I know that for you listening, if you don't have that environment, it's very frustrating to hear people say this, because you're like, well, that's all very well for you, Olly, but I can't have that. And I don't have that anymore now in the languages that I'm learning. And so I think what's important to take from this is that I was doing this, the story I've just told you is what I did in a very condensed time frame. And a lot of people that I talk to and people that I've interviewed on this channel have had these very intense early life experiences. And it can be tempting for us to look at that and say, okay, these people have this experience. They often got very fluent in the language, and that's how you learn a language. But it doesn't have to be that way. And the way that I approach language learning now, thanks to my experience learning Portuguese and other languages, is to say, okay, I know I need to make this part of my life, but I'm not in such a rush anymore. So how can I do this in a way that integrates into my lifestyle? I try to do the same thing with health and fitness as well. Like, no, I'm not going to have that cake, because actually the way I want my lifestyle to be is actually clean eating, right? Or, I'm going to take an hour to go for a walk today because I want my lifestyle to have exercise and activity in it. It's the same with languages. How can you do things that make the language a part of your life? Yeah, I'm going to read for an hour today. Even though I may not feel much progress from 1 minute to the next, I'm going to do it because I want the language as part of my life. And yes, even though I'm tired, I'm going to go out and meet my friend for a language exchange because my life is a life with that language in it, and I'm going to design it that way. And that is what I take from that experience, because even I now, with my long track record of languages, I can't replicate what I did when I was younger in exactly the same way. So you have to find different ways of doing that. But just to finish off the story of when I was in Brazil, because I think this is also quite instructive. I had gone to Brazil with chasing this dream of kind of Brazil, of becoming Brazilian. And I have to tell you that after living in Rio for 6 months, I discovered that I didn't want to be Brazilian. And I didn't want to become Brazilian. I didn't like Rio. I didn't like living there. I think it's a great place to visit, but I didn't like living there. And the truth is that the reason is because that's just not me. As much as I love it, as much as I respect it, I'm not the person that you have to be when you live in an environment like Rio, like extremely extroverted, going out all the time, like relentless positivity. It's the thing that I love about Brazil, but it's also the thing that I can't be myself, and I'm not that person. And so it was a very strange experience leaving Brazil, because I felt a huge sense of relief. And this is also a very important thing to understand when you're kind of chasing these language dreams, is that you do, to a certain extent, have to be careful what you wish for. Because we tend to have in our lives, and especially with language learning, this destination in mind. When I'm fluent, I'll be able to do this. So much so that we can forget about the journey itself. And so it's so important to remember that language learning, it has to be about the journey and not the destination. It's like the same concept of financial freedom. We always have this idea of, when I have X amount of money, I'll be financially free. But of course, that day never arrives either. It's always a moving target. The goalposts keep moving, and it's the same with language learning. And so one of the big lessons I take from this is that, yes, you have to make it part of your life, but the lifestyle and making language learning part of your life is the point. It's not the destination. There is no destination. You've got to do it in a way that you enjoy. And as a consequence of that, it doesn't matter how fluent you become. Yeah, I know you want to become more fluent. I get it. I do too. But when all's said and done, it's the journey. And, if you read books like the Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, I believe the title is, it's always people always say things like, I wish I just enjoyed myself more. I wish I had the courage to be myself more, rather than kind of always chasing things, chasing some future target. So hopefully that is helpful in some way. If you are interested in learning Portuguese through stories with my Portuguese Uncovered course, then please check the link below. But really, this experience learning Portuguese is only part of a much kind of longer timeline that's kind of spanned 20 years of my life and learning 8 languages and a lot of other things that kind of led me to that point. So if you'd like to hear about my kind of complete journey with life and languages, then you should check out this video, because there I talk a lot about not just my languages, but also music and my teaching and all those things. So click this video over here right now to feel a little bit more about who is this guy.